Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this VERA webinar series focusing on contemporary curriculum debates in early childhood education. My name is Nikki Fairchild, and I'm convener of the Early Childhood Education and Care SIG alongside Dr. Louise Kay. This is the second of 3 webinars we hope will provoke discussion and debate about the purpose of curriculum in the early years. As part of this webinar series, we invite you to consider how curriculum drives pedagogy and practice, and to reflect on the role of practitioners in this process. We hope you've had an opportunity to read the chapters we shared from the recent book by Claire Cameron and Peter Moss. It's free to download if you haven't done so already, so further details can be found on the event flyer. Of particular interest for this presentation might be chapters 4, 5 and 6. This evening we'll be listening to Dr. Nathan Archer, a postdoctoral researcher from the University of Leeds, who will be presenting his work on ECEC professionalism, agency and activism. Next week, our final presentation will be from Nancy Stewart, who will join us to talk about the recent publication of the Birth to 5 Matters framework. The format of the session will run as follows. Nathan will do his presentation, which will last approximately 30 minutes, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions on the Slido app as he talks. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, and I'll pose questions to Nathan asked during and after the presentation. I'll try and get through as many questions as I can. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Nathan Archer. Dr. Archer is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Leeds on a Childcare During COVID project and a researcher for Nuffield Foundation on the Changing Face of Early Childhood series. He originally trained as a Montessori early years teacher and primary teacher and has worked with children between the age ranges of birth and 11. Nathan has worked in early education policy and practice for a range of organisations at local, regional and national levels. He's an Associate of Early Education and an Associate Editor of the Journey of Early Childhood Research. Welcome, Nathan. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks so much, Nikki. Thanks for that introduction. And also thank you to you and Louise for the invitation to present and be part of this series on curriculum debates in early childhood education and care. So good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for being here. During this session, what I'd like to do is share some research from my recent doctoral study, some reflections on resistance and activism in early childhood education, a topic which has preoccupied me for the last 3 or 4 years, including completing a thesis during multiple lockdowns as well. So it's yes, certainly kept me preoccupied. So this is the title of my thesis, and whilst I'll focus on findings and thinking on the topic of activism and resistance, specifically with regards to professional identities in early childhood, I want to use that to think about current debates around the early years curriculum. So by way of an overview, I'd like to cover, first of all, some reflections about what I see as the pervasive nature of neoliberalism and how it shapes thinking and policy around professional identities and curricula in early years. And then I want to explore understandings of resistance and activism, and think about the definitions of those concepts and offer some alternative readings that I think are more appropriate to work in early childhood. I'll also share some stories from the field, so data from the research, and offer some insights into how educators might be pushing back on some of these constructions in policy. And then finally, I want to use that thinking on current curriculum debates and the resistance of educators in context specifically in England today. So, thinking about why study resistance and activism, well, initially my sort of exploration of the literature didn't find a great deal to draw on, so that was a really important gap as a starting point in the process. I also perceived a real dissonance between workforce reform policy, as it's called, and the lived experiences of educators. And that came from both personal experience and from discussions with colleagues over the years as well. So I felt that this played out in really complex interrelationships between practice, but also at micro level policy making as well, the sort of tensions between those two. So I was really interested in this agency structure debate, and to what extent structures dominate, and to what extent individuals have opportunities to sort of push back on that. So the study aimed to reveal power discourses in policy, but also those counter narratives in the field as well. And I'll share some examples of that with you shortly. So I wanted to share with you, if I can just go back one. Sorry, just a final reason for the nature of the study. So this is a little bit about personal background, and I hope you'll indulge me with this photograph of me from my early years. And I was inspired by Liz Jesworth's presentation last week, including photographs from her childhood. And I wanted to include this, because there were no other photographs of children in the presentation for reasons of consent. But secondly, it just acts as a springboard really to illustrate my point about the formative influences of my background on the choice of this study. So clearly I'm looking very happy here, and I think this was a real milestone moment for me. I think this was the day that the stabilizers came off the Raleigh budgie, and so that might explain the smile. But anyway, the reason that I wanted to include this was to reflect on family influences on personal background. As well as my own training as an early years teacher, I also come from a family of early educators. Both my mum and her twin sister have just retired after 40-something years of teaching in early childhood education. My mum was an active member of what was then known as the Preschool Playgroups Association, and I have very vivid memories of her returning from a national conference, invigorated and enthused after taking the stand. So I'm sure she won't mind me saying she was a very active and very vocal member of the organisation. Her father, in turn, was a shop steward for a local union branch in an industry in decline in the 1980s. So he was an activist for most of his working life and a really formative influence on me. So it doesn't take any great leap of imagination to see how I arrived at the topic of this study. Anyway, thank you for indulging me with that trip down memory lane, but hopefully it provided a little bit of context to the study as well. So on to perhaps a more sobering topic, and the first of those points that I wanted to cover. And I'd like to think about the socioeconomic and political frame to this study, but also to the times that we live in. I think this is increasingly dominated by neoliberal thinking. For me, at the heart of neoliberalism is the framing of everything in economic terms, with the markets enshrining values of competition and individual choice. Neoliberalism's move into education is often known as the GERM, or the Global Education Reform Movement, and that's well documented, but it's often focused on compulsory education or higher education. But there are a group of academics who are now researching the impact of this economic and cultural force and its pervasive reach into early childhood education and care. So there are some examples here of those academics that I wanted to refer to. I'm interested in the ways in which neoliberalism is manifest in different sites, such as policy and curriculum documents and workforce reform. And this growing body of work is incorporated in this list here. So I won't cover this in detail, but there are a number of authors there writing extensively around neoliberalism in early childhood education and care. I did just want to signal that the last one of those in the top paragraph, which is a forthcoming book by Guy Roberts-Holmes and Peter Moss. In fact, I think that's due out imminently. And I think that will be an important text on the topic if people are interested in reading further on this. In addition, there are a number of papers which have really influenced my thinking on specific values in neoliberalism. So the intensification of accountability, particularly assessment for accountability, the commodification and marketization of early childhood. Helen Penn and Eva Lloyd have written extensively about that. Surveillance, Glenda McNaughton's work on surveillance from a Foucauldian perspective has been really formative for me. And also this point around responsibilization, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. But I understand this as the transfer of responsibility from higher authorities to individuals or communities to take responsibility for their own issues and problems. So that's an important point that I'll come back to. So it would be easy and quite understandable to be quite depressed by that picture. And although I do want to explore the power and reach of neoliberalism further through policy into practice, I also want to argue that there are examples of hope and possibility in the creative manoeuvres of early educators. So there is, as Ball and Olmedo suggests, this terrain of resistance, this sort of site of struggle, or this contested space in which educators per se are acting. And I was really interested to try and understand what that meant in early childhood and what was happening in that space and what the resistance looked like. So that was a really important starting point for the study. So in order to get to that point, in order to sort of look more closely at resistance, I firstly wanted to have a look at how an early educator was framed in various policies and how those neoliberal values played out in various early childhood policies. And I began to think about how workforce reform was an important site for this, and how these texts presented the ideal professional identity of early educators. So I undertook a critical discourse analysis of workforce reform policy, and you can see the 9 policy texts that I work with there. So the first 3 in the first row are strategy texts. They may well look familiar to colleagues working in the sector. And the 6 texts at the bottom on the second row there are all workforce standards. So you may well recognise those that are linked to qualified teacher status or early years teacher status, and also the level 3 early years educator standards as well. And I think explicit in those texts are expectations of who the ideal early childhood educator is in terms of who they should be and what they should do. So, having undertaken that analysis, which was quite an extensive piece of work, I just wanted to offer 3 examples of the kind of findings, the kind of analysis that I undertook and what I found in those texts. So the first is an example of governmentality, or the act of self-disciplining or self-governing as an individual. And this is taken from the qualified teacher standards. And interestingly, it states the following statements define the behaviour and attitudes that are expected of a teacher to achieve QTS. And that's a notable shift from an earlier version of standards that seek to depict and elucidate the skills and knowledge that might be required of a qualified teacher. And this is a shift onto behaviour and attitudes. So I think this is a prime example of both the prescription of the attitudes which then follow in that sentence, but also that individuals are expected to self-govern against those prescribed attitudes. The second example is responsibilization, the issue that I was briefly referring to before, this idea of the transfer of responsibility from higher authorities to a community. And this text is taken from the More Great Childcare document from 2013, that again, I'm sure is familiar to many. And this policy text has created a view of the early educator as insufficiently entrepreneurial. It says, despite some recent improvements, the early years profession has not broken out of the cycle of low pay and low status. And I think what's suggested here is that despite government interventions, and you may well recall that this was there was a proposal in this document about changes to staffing ratios. So despite government proposals and interventions on these staffing ratios, it's the early years profession that hasn't broken out of the cycle of low pay and low status. And I suggest that this acts to de-responsibilise the authorities and responsibilise a profession for its pay and status. In addition to this, it fails to make the link between the pay of educators and the responsibility of government through funding levels which settings receive. And then the final example that I wanted to share with you is an example of performativity and accountability. And I think this more closely links with our topic of discussion for this evening around the curriculum. But these words are taken from both early years teacher standards and early years educator standards, which suggest that candidates are expected to demonstrate a clear understanding of the teaching of systematic synthetic phonics. So notwithstanding the debate on the efficacy of focusing alone on systematic synthetic phonics, what I want to suggest is that this discourse closes down opportunities for students to engage in a debate and explore alternatives and complementary approaches to early literacy teaching. These standards make a government-sanctioned approach explicit, and they're a means to optimize learner outcomes through a really prescribed method. So to my mind, the candidate is framed not as a teacher of early literacy, but a teacher of early phonics. So taken together, what I want to argue is that these neoliberal informed policies, these ideal professional identities that are created, are framing the educator as one who is compliant, but also at the same time autonomous and entrepreneurial, and subject to vertical surveillance by regulators, but also horizontal surveillance by peers, and arguably by self-surveillance as well. So following on from that policy analysis, I want to turn to experiences, explore experiences in the field. But before I do that, I'd like to gauge your views on the concept of activism. And I think this is where the magic of Slido kicks in. And I wanted to pose the question, what kinds of activity do activists engage in? And to just get your sense of what that meant to you. So hopefully that has appeared on your screen and given you the opportunity to type some words in there. Great, I'm getting a message to say it has, thank you. So I'd be interested to just hear your thoughts about the actions related to activism. This was an exercise I did with a whole bunch of post-its at the beginning of the process, but this is far more engaging and dynamic as well to see it all kind of emerging on the screen. So research is very prominent there, obviously, but we also see campaigning and questioning. Action research as well, okay, that's a great example. Choosing not to act, yes, that's an important alternative, isn't it? Campaigning, pushing back, protesting. Oh, some great thoughts here. Playing the game, that's an interesting one as well. Awareness raising, social movement. Excellent. Well, I hope we can keep that, because that's really helpful to sort of have that collection of thoughts on there, challenging the status quo. challenging others, awareness raising. Silence, okay, yes, I guess that's like choosing not to act, yes. Great, that's excellent. Thank you so much for engaging with that. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. Okay, so as I said, I sort of started that process with a whole bunch of post-it notes in a similar vein, but I was also really keen to understand sort of popular definitions and popular understandings. And I remember Googling activism, and perhaps unsurprisingly, there were lots of images of street marches and protests and demonstrations with placards that came up. And so I went back to dictionary definitions of activism, and interestingly, of the three that I read, there were a number that were very, very different. And there was a significant gap in one of them, and that was about the public or visible nature of activism. And in one of the dictionaries, that wasn't present. So it seemed to me that there was a gap in sort of understanding around that I wanted to interrogate a little bit further. I also wanted to look at existing theories, and it seemed to me that many existing theorizations of activism were not as applicable or helpful in an early childhood context as I might have hoped. And then thirdly, I also looked to theoretical interpretations of resistance as well, but there was very little empirical evidence to draw on in terms of what resistance looked like in early childhood contexts. So that's when I began to sort of rethink resistance and activism. So, as I said, much of the literature on activism, particularly in education, focuses on social movement theories and lobbying and unionization. And whilst it was important to acknowledge this, I thought that a lot of the activism that I'd experienced might be framed in a different way. So I actually turned to feminist geographers to offer alternative readings of how activism might play out in early childhood education. So there were three ideas here that I just wanted to mention briefly. The first is about how activism can be embedded in everyday encounters. So these activisms are, as I say, embedded in the everyday, but they're also entwined with other scales. So they might exist in the everyday, but they might also exist on larger, more public, more visible scales. I also drew on Jo Elbing Clark's paper on small and implicit activisms when thinking about that as well, which was really, really helpful. There's work by O'Shaughnessy and Kennedy who talk about relational activism as a way of thinking about activism as an individual, as a member of a community, using daily practice to change norms, but also making change happen through personal and informal relationships. And that to me seemed really appropriate. And then finally, Dove and Fisher write about compassionate activism, which is both emotionally reinforcing and contagious. So taken together, they seem to me as really important and useful alternatives to activism, which might be seen as a bit more combative. And then thinking about changes thinking about alternatives in resistance studies. And there's writing about how resistance might be considered dispersed or small scale. These writers propose that it's performed by one or a few individuals, but it's unorganized and it's performed in scattered places, which I thought was quite an unusual but an interesting way of thinking about resistance. And then Williams suggests that there are these three continua that we map resistance on: overt, covert, micro, macro, and passive and active. So again, an alternative that really made sense to me in reading the data. So following that literature review, I wanted to understand to what extent educators might be enacting resistance and activism differently, both to the definitions that I started with and to popular understandings of the term. I wanted to understand what was going on at a school or setting level for individuals, and how they might be countering the dominance of those policy discourses that I talked about. But I also wanted to turn up the volume on inaudible voices, as Peter Clough says. And I did that through professional life story interviews with educators in the field. So these are the colleagues who very generously gave of their time for those interviews. So you can see pseudonyms there, but a whole range of professional roles of educators who spoke to me about their experiences. I went on a road trip from the southwest of England to the Scottish borders to talk to these individuals, and it was sort of really great to hear their experiences across their life course. And together we formed a number of narratives of their life experiences that I'd like to share just a handful of those with you now. So I should start by saying that these titles of these clips and these sort of narratives that I wanted to share with you are taken from the language from the participants themselves. So in a sense, they're sort of self-titled. So Mark here saw himself very much as a champion of children's play. Mark was a foundation unit leader in a primary school in the south of England, and he was struggling but succeeding to reconcile both personal and pedagogical values with demands of sort of macro level policy and the meso level of school management. And so you can see here, he says, as a leader on senior leadership team, we get all the pressure, but my team, I'm fortunate in that they say, don't forget this, we know it works. I have to teach synthetic phonics every day. You can make it playful, but it's not play. And similarly with maths input as well. He says, I don't claim to be right. I'm opinionated and passionate, and we should debate this, but it shouldn't be about if you play and value play, you are devalued. So you have to have this subversive curriculum underneath. So clearly Mark saw these interventions as very divorced from his philosophy of play, which he advocated. And as a solution, Mark was having to negotiate these demands and sort of mediate the effects of the interventions that he didn't agree with. But I think this idea of having a subversive curriculum underneath is a really powerful one. And he said, I recognize I work in a school and a system and I have to do it, but then I get back to the richness to what children do best. And the second one is a story also from a primary school teacher. Fran was a reception teacher, and she perceived herself as an activist by accident. She hadn't set out to be so, but in a similar way to Mark, she was struggling to reconcile a really performative agenda that was data-driven with her own practice. And she says the activist stuff is because of policy and how fundamentally flawed a lot of it is. And that's why I take the stand that I do. I don't do things to get data, and that's the problem I'm going to have. I won't cram with children. Some will say I'm not teaching well enough. But then she goes on to say that she worries about Ofsted, and they may think, oh, Fran is at that school, she says all this stuff, and look at her data. And she takes this back to the idea of ethical practice. So noticeably, the surveillance of Ofsted was seen to be at odds with Fran's ethical practice. And in addition to her resisting at a local level, she was also involved in national activism. And she says, I was just trying to rally people and say, we haven't got to sit and take this. I can't stand by while this stuff is going on. They are getting data, but at what cost? And then the third example is from an educator in a day nursery called Amy. Oh, that's a pseudonym anyway. Amy was the leader of the toddler room for 2-year-old children. And she describes herself as disruptive and a subverter. And this example conveys how Amy managed to both comply with and disrupt a policy. So she was talking about the 2-year-old progress check. And she said, every time I met a parent, I would say, we have to do this and we're supposed to use this criteria. So I've written a report which reflects where they are in the prime areas. But actually, I want you to understand this is not your child, and this is a very narrow way of assessing who your child is and what they can and cannot do, and where they are on the life journey. So to my mind, Amy manages to both comply with and disrupt this policy on the 2-year progress check. So she's simultaneously limited by, but refusing to be limited by, this assessment policy. And I sort of read this as an example of creative compliance and subversion. So these are just 3 examples from a number of professional life stories, which illustrate different examples of resistance and activism. And I've sort of framed these as being agency within limits, of bounded agency, of many examples of educators finding ways to mediate and negotiate and navigate their way around policy discourses, but also subverting and disrupting the status quo. And it was really interesting to see your words of subversion and disruption in there, in the word cloud earlier. I think that's exactly what's going on here. But I also wanted to signal this idea of critical agency that Rubegini talks about, and the refusal to adapt oneself. So in my mind, these examples that I've just shared are not just acts of resistance. They're both the rejection of something, but also the imagination of alternative ways of doing things. That was something that really spoke to me from those narratives. So I want to move on again, just to gauge your thoughts and your experiences. And we have an interactive activity on Slido again, and this is a multiple choice activity. So I'm interested in your experiences of what have been the main focus of resistance, of activism, either as you've engaged in it or as you've observed it in others. So I'll put the question and the Slido slide there. We're slightly limited by the number of options that I've put on there. So these that I've chosen are from my study that were most sort of prominent in the research, but you may well have others that come to mind. If you do, then feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we'll perhaps pick those up as part of the conversation at the end of the presentation. So I'll leave you to just have a look at that. So curriculum and assessment seems to be dominating at the moment. It's certainly the topic of the day, isn't it? Okay, so still quite significantly ahead of those other thoughts. Okay, I think that seems to be slowing down. So thank you very much for sharing that. Clearly curriculum and assessment way ahead of the other issues there. But as I said, if you do have other thoughts about topics or issues that have been the focus of resistance or activism, then do put that in Q&A, and we'll perhaps come back to that. So thank you for that. So I wanted to move on to the 4th bullet point that I wanted to cover tonight, thinking about how all of this thinking feeds into current curriculum debates. And I just wanted to signal the work of other critical policy analysts working in this field. Particular Professor Elizabeth Wood at the University of Sheffield. I'm sure colleagues are very familiar with Elizabeth's work, but I just wanted to point to this particular paper, which is a critical discourse analysis of the EYFS, which was in the Journal of Early Childhood Research last year, which colleagues may want to sort of follow up on. And also the chapter in the Transforming Early Childhood in England book and the chapter by Trevor Ince and Ang that's particularly focused on the curriculum. And that's been really formative in my thinking, particularly this idea about goals and outcomes being increasingly tightly defined, but also in bold at the bottom there, the way in which the EYFS has itself evolved, where the narrative has strayed away from a flexible approach to care and learning to one in which these authors argue an understanding of curriculum is now conflated with, it now conflates development education with instructional training. So that's a really, really informative and formative chapter if people are interested in reading a bit more about current curriculum debates. So that's informed my thinking. And I wanted to highlight just a few points here about how I think the neoliberal values that I talked about earlier and that I think are present in the work of those authors, how they manifest in relation to current curriculum debates. So firstly, I think we see this in relation to how the primary assessment consultation has driven wholesale changes in the EYFS. So democratic processes and engagement in the sector were far from paramount. Secondly, there's this notion of delivering a curriculum, or deliverology, as Barber calls it, and that's become commonplace. And I think it frames the educator as a compliant technician with a centrally prescribed curriculum to be conveyed. And I think that's indicative of a knowledge curriculum rather than one which is more relational and evolving and emergent. We've also witnessed very centrally prescribed catch-up programs as well that are focused on school readiness. And we now have multiple summative assessments in the phase as well. So the 2-year progress check, the baseline assessment, the profile, and soon after the phonics screening check as well. I think they're driven by a growing accountability agenda. And there's now a plethora of corrective interventions, largely derived through randomized control trials. And I think we have this cycle now of test and intervene, or assess and intervene, that's applied as standards. So they're all issues of concern to me in current curriculum debates. That said, I think there are a number of collective responses. So colleagues may well be familiar with the More Than a Score campaign against testing, and particularly against the reception baseline assessment. Also, keeping early years unique is an important and growing grassroots campaign on a number of early childhood issues. And the Early Years Coalition of 16 organisations that have come together to produce Birth to Five Matters is also a really significant development, I think, in recent months. But I won't say any more about that because I know Nancy Stewart will be talking about that next week. So I think it's really important that we focus our attention not just on the map, but on the actual terrain, as Gunilla Dahlberg says. And whilst the focus on the power of policy text is really important, I want to argue that it's in our nurseries and settings and classrooms that we see sites of power and resistance. These are sites where pedagogical decision-making and values are playing out. So in conclusion, I just wanted to signal 2 key ideas. The first is around the issue of hope that I think is present in all of those narratives that I've shared with you this evening, and indeed many others in the thesis. And although that's a whole body of literature that I've not ventured into in terms of hope, this is a particularly interesting text, I think, and one that's caught my attention. And it's written by, or it's edited by Kress and Lake, but it's comprised of a series of letters by academics and educators to future educators, and hence the title, "We Saved the Best for You, Letters of Hope, Imagination and Wisdom for 21st Century Educators." So anyone looking for some hope and some inspiration, you might want to have a look at that text. So I just wanted to conclude with this key idea that I think is also present in the narratives of educators that I spoke to. And it's the idea of critical awareness or critical literacy. And I think it's very similar to ideas of Freire, critical consciousness, or conscientization, and also Maxine Green's idea of living with wide awakeness, aware of what it means to be in the world. And it's this particular quote by Green that I wanted to end on, and I think it's a really powerful idea. And she says, the educator must be awake, critical, and open to the world. It's an honor and a responsibility to be a teacher in such dark times. Consciousness doesn't come automatically. It comes through being alive, awake, curious, and often furious. So for me, that's a really profound statement, a really powerful idea. And it's one that I hope for those of us involved in the education of early educators, that we continue to sort of nurture in them, that they're wide awake in the world. So thank you very much for listening. And there's a whole wall of references there that I'll happily send to anyone who is interested in following any of that up. But thanks very much for your attention this evening.
Nathan, thank you for your very thought-provoking presentation. We've been tweeting rapidly while you're talking, so I'm hoping that people outside of this briefing can actually see what the key messages were. We're already starting to get some questions in, so if people do want to raise a question, please do pop them in the Slido, and I will start off with the questions that we have. The first one comes from Jo, and she's asking, Nathan, she's involved in teacher education and interested to hear your views about what sort of guidance and advice we can offer young teachers, and maybe the ways they can push back and develop their activism.
Sure, yeah. So I guess two things from that presentation I would reiterate really. First of all, is exploring this definition of activism, and perhaps moving away from conventional understandings that it necessarily has to be public and visible. And actually much of the pushback, as you'll have seen from the educators that I spoke to, was on a local level. It was often what one described as quiet activism, which I thought was a kind of nice turn of phrase, nice idea, but nonetheless powerful. So, you know, I think the idea that we can operate in our sphere of influence on a micro level, this kind of micro activism, is really important. And I guess the second thing I would just reiterate is this idea of critical awareness. I think it's absolutely key to encourage and try to sort of engender in colleagues, really, that we remain really vigilant and really aware of some of those policy drivers. So the fact, for example, that one of the participants was really cognizant of the way the school readiness agenda was really driving baseline assessment. So this wasn't an assessment for the teacher to work with, or for parents to be aware of. It was absolutely about data and accountability. So that's just an example, really, of I think, what I hope we can encourage in educators of the future.
Thank you, Nathan. And actually, your comments on the individual and the local leads quite nicely into Marco's question. He's asking, in his opinion, your examples are of individual and isolated efforts. According to Castells, social change happens when we convince others, when we create a collective thinking. And he's wondering, are your examples maybe shaped by capitalism and individuality?
That's a really, really interesting point. I guess, first of all, what I would say is that whilst some of those examples were maybe sort of individual and isolated, they were often operating in tandem with more collective or collaborative endeavours. Although I have to say there were more examples of what I would describe as individual activism in the data. The question around whether capitalism and this sort of neoliberal landscape shapes that is a really interesting one. And I've been reflecting on the fragmentation within the sector. So unlike the primary and secondary sector of education, which is predominantly state maintained or at least state funded, obviously early childhood is much more diverse, and we have public, private and voluntary sector provision. The DFE described that as a mixed market. So in many ways, policy frames those that provision as competitors rather than as as collaborators, really. So I think there's certainly an argument there that kind of wider socio-political landscape shapes some of that activism. Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm going to add a secondary question to that around how maybe some of the things that you mentioned on the last slide, or second to last slide, about the collective activism of the sector. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about how that might help us maybe create a combined voice potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a sector that, because of the diversity and fragmentation that I just spoke about, has not been largely unionized in the way that other elements of the sector have. So it's really heartening, I think, to see these grassroots movements from organisations such as More Than a Score and the Early Years Coalition. I think in many ways we've perhaps reached a point where the issues have kind of forced this kind of collaboration and collective endeavour, and I think it's really positive to see that in areas around the curriculum and assessment. But I'd like to see similar movements around issues of funding and around the workforce as well.
Lovely, thank you. Next question comes from Liz. Her question is, do you think that stories of resistance can become alternative forms of evidence-based practice that foreground local and relational forms of curriculum?
Yes, in short. Yeah, I think there's a really interesting event later in the week that BELMAS are running around storytelling in leadership. And I think one of the interesting elements of one of those I think it's relational activism that I drew on, was about the power of story sharing. So not just storytelling, but that's a reciprocal process, and that story sharing becomes really, really important. And I think one of the things that's key to that is about having the platforms to enable that story sharing. So it's also about the visibility of these stories. So absolutely, yes, it could be about evidence informed practice, but maybe we need to find or create the spaces that enable these stories to be more public.
Thank you. And actually that ties into Kath's question as well. What forms of activism do you think are likely to be the most effective in the current climate?
Ooh, there's a big question. I think it takes multiple forms, and I think we almost have to operate on multiple levels. So I wouldn't want to take anything away from the power and the effects of those small scale, often local and micro level activisms, but I do think that the collective endeavours and the opportunities to push back in more public and collective ways are all the more important now. Yeah, we need to find spaces to have that collective voice, particularly given that fragmentation that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, there's a lot to be activist about in my mind. So yeah, operating on those multiple levels is going to be key, I think, to creating some change.
That's great, thank you. And that leads me really nicely into Guy's question. Thank you, Nathan. Guy says, very interesting. Given that Baseline has been pushed back twice by professionals acting together, do you think it might be pushed back for a third time? Is there a concerted resistance and refusal to introduce Baseline? And then to follow on from that, is the NEU important here?
Yeah, I sincerely hope so, Guy. As you say, it has been pushed back at least twice. I mean, this must be something like the fifth iteration of Baseline in one form or of another, and it never seems to endure. But if we can find a way to resist it before implementation, then absolutely we need to do that. I think historically, with More Than a Score, parents have been very engaged in that fight as well, and that they are a very powerful source of support in many of these challenges. And I think if we can further engage parents and carers and articulate the story of what Baseline is in its current iteration as just this black box data, I think maybe we can succeed in sort of getting that overturned again. At least I hope so. And sorry, could you just reiterate the second part of that question?
Yeah, I think the NEU, so it's talking about
Right.
unionisation. Is that a
Yeah.
way forward, maybe?
Yeah, quite possibly. And I know that the NEU have made significant strides in recent months to better engage the early childhood sector. There's the early years reference group, and also a movement with Facebook group and other sort of social media platforms. And it seems that the executive is very engaged in speaking to the sector, and I hope that we can build some momentum really, and kind of galvanise the community to join in and sort of formalise those collective endeavours through a union. Yeah, hope so.
Lovely, thank you. Christina has a question. She says, I love the idea of quiet and invisible activism that is intentional and deliberate resistance emerging through critical engagements. I wonder if you also think this invisible activism can also operate less consciously and effectively, and that can unexpectedly emerge as a kind of collective rage.
Right. Okay. That's a really interesting way to think about it. That sense of it being emergent is also really interesting. I'm thinking back to one of the participants who felt incredibly principled, if I can just share this example, incredibly principled about loose parts and outdoor play. And it was being resisted by much of the management in the school that she worked in. And she came along to a presentation that I was talking about, about activism, and we spoke about this afterwards. And she began to reframe her resistance, or reframe her actions as resistance and activism. And she'd not really thought about it in that way before. So it was an example of something that was emerging, and this idea of kind of critical awareness and conscientization. She was increasingly mindful and framing her actions as resistance and activism. So that was an example of something emerging. And sorry, I forgot the second part of that again.
That's okay. It's about maybe this invisible activism can operate less consciously and effectively, and that can maybe unexpectedly emerge as a kind of collective rage potentially.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So collective rage. That's a really interesting way to frame it, and maybe these examples of kind of dispersed activism and resistance are beginning to coalesce. And maybe the examples that we gave around More Than a Score, Keeping Early Years Unique, and other movements are beginning to draw in these individuals who have maybe felt really isolated, and maybe felt that their resistance has been invisible, and maybe that's what we need now, these movements to sort of snowball and grow in momentum. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. Harriet's asked a question that was linked to Liz's question. Harriet's asking, do you feel these relational forms of curriculum constitute the implicit, hidden curriculum that is embedded in everyday practices as part of care in an ethical human rights frame?
That's an interesting one. That the sort of human rights frame is not a particular lens with which I've looked at it before, so I'm not sure I can offer a great deal to sort of responding in that way. Although certainly those framings of relational activism, compassionate activism, link really well with the ethic of care. So I think there's absolute synergy there between those. Yeah.
Thank you. I've got another question that links on from Harriet. It's around ethics as well, because I get the sense that ethics is a big focus for the educators. So how did they balance ethics and resistance and curriculum? And were there any personal costs to them that they talked to you about?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because one of the sections that I wrote about was about walking away. So there were 3 examples across the data set. One colleague in higher education and 2 in school settings, who all walked away from situations where they felt they couldn't reconcile their personal values, their personal principles, with demands either from sort of management or kind of cultural expectations in those settings. So I began to look at walking away both as an act of resistance and as an act of self-care as well. So that for me is a really interesting dynamic, that idea of leaving, but also that being both an act of kind of negating what was presented to them, but also self-care as well. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question really around sort of personal ethics. And yeah, it was really, really interesting, and I didn't see that necessarily as a negative. So by removing themselves from those situations, I felt it was a sort of refusal, a rejection, a refusal to engage really with the cultural values of the organisation they were working in.
And I think some of that came out in one of the word clouds around walking away or refusing. You know, that sort of mode of resistance can sometimes be the only option, I suppose, for people.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, real tensions, but absolutely an important and a valid response.
Indeed. So, colleagues, we have 4 minutes left, and I have no more questions left in the question section, unless anyone else wants to pop anything in there for the last few minutes. While we're waiting, I just want to really thank Nathan for his presentation. Thank you. It was really informative and actually quite inspiring to think about the ways that we can move beyond some of this neoliberalism and governmentality. And I know that Peter Moss and Claire Cameron's book cover some of these things. And I know Guy and Peter's book, which I think is out very, very soon, around neoliberalism and education, might be something that colleagues want to look into, to start to maybe unpick and think more about some of these debates.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'll be a key text, and hopefully we can continue this debate in one arena or another. Yeah.
Indeed. I think we're hoping to maybe get a blog, Nathan, aren't we, together, a BERA blog, so that we can start to unpick some of this and maybe make some links to your research and papers and those types of things.
Absolutely, and make the links across these sessions as well with Liz's work and also Nancy speaking next week. So that'll be great. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So, colleagues, I think we've probably come to the end of the session. There's no more questions. I'd like to thank you so much for your attendance today. It's been a pleasure having you with us. Twitter's gone absolutely mad, which is great because it's good to have ECEC over Twitter for a change. So can I all wish you a very safe and engaging evening when you think about the things we've talked about today. For BERA members, the video should be on the BERA website very, very soon. And we're hoping to welcome some more of you back next week when we talk to Nancy Stewart. But today, thank you so much, Nathan. It's been an absolute pleasure hearing you talk. And we're looking forward to seeing your blog and any papers and any more research that you do moving forward. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Good evening, everybody.